Narrator, dark, low, rhythmic. Take a close look at this photograph. Taken in the autumn of 1924, it was supposed to be a simple, solemn keepsake, a family gathered on their porch, frozen in time. But when the negative was developed, the photographer noticed something that sent a chill straight down his spine. Behind the youngest daughter, staring directly into the lens, was a face that belonged to no one in that room. The decade was the Roaring Twenties, a time when humanity was caught in a strange, restless liminal space. Modernity was accelerating at a breakneck pace, yet the dark shadows of the Great War and the devastating 1918 influenza pandemic still hung heavy over millions of households. Death had visited nearly every doorstep. Grief was a permanent guest in the American home. It was during this fragile era that the obsession with spiritualism reached its absolute fever pitch. People were desperate. They turned to seances, spirit boards, and mediumship, anything, anyone, who promised a whisper of contact with the loved ones they had lost too soon. And no medium was more convincing, nor more terrifying, than the camera. In the October of 1924, in a quiet, coastal town in Massachusetts, the Miller family decided to sit for a formal portrait. The patriarch, Arthur Miller, was a stern, pragmatic man who had spent months restoring his family's isolated, late 18th century Victorian home. Joining him were his wife, Clara, their 3 teenage sons, and their youngest child, a fragile 9-year-old girl named Eleanor. To document the family's modest prosperity, Arthur hired an itinerant photographer named Thomas Vance. Vance was an experienced craftsman who traveled from town to town with his heavy wooden box camera, glass plate negatives, and portable flash powder rig. He was a man of cold, hard science who viewed photography strictly as chemistry and light. The day of the shoot was overcast, cold, and unusually quiet. The fog rolling in off the Atlantic muffled the sounds of the nearby woods, creating a suffocating, breathless atmosphere. Vance set up his tripod in the front yard, framing the family as they stood on the wraparound porch. Arthur stood tall in the center, Clara sat on a wooden chair beside him, and the children grouped closely around them. Vance carefully adjusted his heavy black drape, peered through the lens, and aligned the shot. He noted later in his journals that the light was flat, but clear. There was nothing unusual about the porch. No reflective glass behind them, no hanging garments, no strange shadows. Just 6 living, breathing people standing against the dark wood of the house. "Hold still," Vance instructed, pulling the flash pan high above his head. With a brilliant burst of blinding white light and a sharp crack of magnesium smoke, the moment was captured. The silver halide on the heavy glass plate chemically locked the Millers into history. Vance capped the lens, packed his gear, and retired to a makeshift darkroom he had constructed in the town's small tavern cellar. That night, under the dim, eerie glow of a crimson safelight, Vance sloshed the glass plate in developer fluid. Slowly, the image began to emerge from the milky chemical emulsion. First came the harsh outlines of the porch railing. Then the dark wool suits of the Miller boys. Then the stern, unblinking features of Arthur Miller. Vance adjusted his magnifying loupe to check the sharp focus of the faces. He scanned from left to right, boy, father, mother, boy, boy, and then he stopped at little Eleanor. Standing just behind Eleanor's right shoulder, wedged into the pitch-black gap between the girl and the wooden front door, was an 8th figure. It wasn't a double exposure. The grain of the wood behind the head was completely blocked, meaning whatever was there was solid. Physical. Vance leaned closer, his pulse spiking. It was a human face. But it was entirely wrong. The skin was unnaturally pale, almost luminous against the dark shadows of the porch. Its head was tilted at an unnatural, sickly angle, as if its neck had been snapped. The mouth was stretched open in a wide, silent, hollow oval, and the eyes were not white and dark pupils, but solid, glossy black voids staring straight at the camera. Vance wiped the plate, thinking a hair or dust particle had settled on the gel. But as the developer locked the image into place, the nightmare only grew clearer. The face wasn't hovering in the background. It was leaning forward, its faint, emaciated hand resting softly, almost affectionately, on 9-year-old Eleanor's shoulder. And Eleanor had felt it. Because when Vance looked even closer at the young girl's face in the photo, he realized her right shoulder wasn't level with her left. It was subtly compressed, pitched slightly downward, exactly as it would be if a physical weight were pressing into the fabric of her Sunday dress. Vance pushed his magnifying loupe closer to the fiber-grained paper until the silver halide crystals blurred into a storm of gray and black. He tracked the hand. Long, impossibly slender fingers tapered into thin, translucent nails. They didn't just overlap Eleanor's shoulder, they pinched the velvet fabric, gathering a tiny fold of cloth between two gaunt knuckles. It wasn't an optical illusion. It wasn't a double exposure caused by a sticking shutter mechanism, nor was it a phantom reflection bouncing off the studio lens. The physical displaced geometry of the dress proved that something had been standing there, occupying real volume, displacing real air, when the flash powder ignited. A cold, needle-like shiver ran down Vance's spine, settling at the base of his neck. He looked up from the wash tray. Across the darkroom, hanging on a twine wire strung beneath the rafters, was the original glassplate negative. The unlit bulb above it cast long, grotesque shadows across the red-lit room. Vance stepped over, his apron squeaking in the quiet, and unclipped the heavy glass rectangle. He held it up to the dim safe light. On the negative, everything was reversed. Light was dark, dark was light. The Miller family, Arthur, his wife Margaret, and young Eleanor, were pale specters carved out of black emulsion. And there, standing inches behind Eleanor's chair, was the dark cutout of the fourth figure. On the negative, where there should have been the pitch-black void of the studio curtain, there was a jagged, dense patch of silver deposit. The figure had reflected light. It had sent photons cascading through the brass lens barrel, burning its image directly into the chemical matrix. It was in the glass, Vance whispered to the empty room. It was in the room. He remembered the sitting vividly. It had been a dreary Tuesday afternoon. Arthur Miller, a stern man with a heavy mustache and eyes clouded by some private, silent grief, had brought his family in for a rare portrait. Margaret had looked exhausted, her knuckles white as she gripped her handbag. And Eleanor. Eleanor had barely spoken a word. She had sat in the carved oak armchair, staring straight ahead, her small body stiff as a board. Vance recalled adjusting the heavy bellows camera on its wooden tripod. He remembered calling out, "Hold still now, just a moment for the light," before squeezing the rubber bulb. He had heard the sharp, metallic snap of the shutter. He had seen the blinding flash of magnesium powder flare and die on the iron tray. And in that split second of illumination, Vance had caught a flicker in his peripheral vision. He had dismissed it as a flash blindness artifact, a stray shadow cast by the heavy velvet drapery behind the chair. But now, looking at the silver-proof glistening in the acid wash, he remembered the faint sound that had followed the flash. A wet, clicking sigh, like a throat catching on dry air. Vance shoved the glass negative back into its paper sleeve and grabbed a lantern. He pulled open the darkroom door and stepped into the main studio space. The studio was dead silent. Shadows stretched like long fingers across the hardwood floorboards. The big portrait camera still stood where it had been 6 hours ago, its black leather bellows stretched out like the accordioned lung of some sleeping beast. The carved oak chair sat empty under the tall, dark studio window. Vance walked slowly toward the chair. He set the lantern on a side table, casting warm, flickering light across the furniture. He knelt by the chair's right armrest. He brought the lantern close, examining the crimson velvet upholstery. At first, he saw nothing, just the worn nap of the fabric where dozens of patrons had rested their arms over the years. But as he adjusted the angle of the flame, a faint mark emerged in the dust resting on the back frame. Right where the stranger's hand would have hovered, the fine layer of gray street dust settled on the wood had been swept clean in 5 distinct, parallel streaks. Something had been leaning over the chair. Something had hung there in the dark, waiting for the flash. Then Vance heard it. It was coming from inside the darkroom he had just left. A slow, rhythmic splash of liquid. Drip. Slosh. Drip. Someone, or something, was agitating the chemical wash tray. Vance's pulse hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sound was unmistakable, the steady, mechanical swish-slosh of an agitated tray, the exact cadence he used when developing a fresh print. Only he was standing in the doorway, and the darkroom behind him was bathed in absolute, suffocating shadow. He reached for the brass handle of the darkroom door, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly dropped his heavy metal flash tray. The room inside was windowless, built into the dead space beneath the grand staircase. There were no drafts. No stray currents of air to rock a plastic tray half filled with acetic acid and stop bath. "Who's in there?" his voice croaked, weak and thin in the massive, hollow house. The liquid sloshed again. Drip. Slosh. Drip. Vance squeezed his eyes shut, counted to 3, and shoved the door wide open. The pungent smell of fixer and silver nitrate hit him like a physical blow, sour and chemical. He reached blindly for the red safe light switch on the wall. The toggle clicked, and the room bathed in a sinister, ruby-hued glow. The room was empty. No intruder leaned over the sink. No thief stood in the corner. But in the center of the dark wooden counter, the rectangular white tray holding the liquid developer was rocking back and forth on its base. Small, red-tinted ripples slammed against the plastic edges. And floating face-up in the solution was a second, fresh sheet of photographic paper that Vance knew, with absolute certainty, he had left unexposed inside the light-proof box on the high shelf. He backed away, his spine slamming against the doorframe, but his eyes remained glued to the tray. As the liquid sloshed over the paper, dark blooms of silver began to rise to the surface. It was developing itself. Without an enlarger, without a glass plate, without a flash of light, the latent image was forcing its way out of the emulsion. Slowly, Vance took a step forward, drawn by a morbid, irresistible pull. He leaned over the tray, the chemical fumes burning his nostrils. The image wasn't the library. It wasn't the estate. It was a tight, suffocating close-up of a human face, or something shaped like one. The skin was pale and stretched impossibly thin over sharp, asymmetrical cheekbones. But it was the eyes that made Vance's breath hitch in his chest. They weren't eyes at all, but deep, hollow craters, as if someone had pressed thumbprints into wet clay. The mouth was stretched open in a wide, silent oval, frozen mid-shriek. And then, Vance noticed the background of the photograph. Behind the terrifying, sunken face was a distinctive pattern carved into dark mahogany, the intricate, swirling floral relief of the very doorframe Vance was currently leaning against. The photograph hadn't been taken years ago. It had been taken here. In this house. From the perspective of the wall right behind him. A sudden, sharp metallic smell cut through the chemical stench of the darkroom, the iron tang of fresh blood, mixed with the damp ozone left behind by a magnesium flash. Vance whirled around, throwing his back against the counter. The hallway outside the darkroom was completely black, the moonlight from the library failing to stretch this far into the interior. He stared out into the hallway, his vision struggling to adapt after staring at the red safe light. From the darkness of the corridor came a faint, wet rustle. Like heavy velvet dragging across dry floorboards. SSSHRHK, SSSHRHK. Mr. Sterling. Vance called out, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the sink. Is that you? Silence answered him. Then, a sharp, singular sound echoed from the library down the hall. Tick. It was the sound of his camera shutter reset lever being pulled back. Vance froze. He had left the heavy box camera mounted on its tripod in the library, pointed directly at the empty high-backed armchair. Tick-click. The mechanical iris of the lens opened, held for an agonizing second, and snapped shut. Something was in the library. Something was taking a picture. Driven by a desperate, instinctual need to understand, or perhaps just the terror of remaining trapped in a tiny red room, Vance crept out into the hallway. He kept his shoulder pressed against the wall, sliding inch by inch toward the faint square of moonlight spilling from the library doorway. The velvet dragging sound had stopped. The house had fallen into a silence so dense it felt heavy, pressing against Vance's eardrums like deep water. He reached the edge of the library frame and peeked around the heavy oak molding. The room was bathed in pale silver light. The tripod stood where he had left it. But the large, bellows camera mounted on top was no longer aimed at the chair. It had been rotated 90 degrees. The massive glass lens was now pointed directly at the doorway. The developer in me wanted to run the image through every forensic tool available, but the human in me was already terrified of what I'd find. I cropped the extra face, isolated the layer, and pushed the exposure. The image didn't blur into noise like a low-light digital artifact usually would. Instead, the features sharpened. It was a girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with sunken eyes and a jaw unhinged just slightly too wide, as if caught in a silent, perpetual scream. Her hair was matted, clinging to her scalp in damp, dark strands. But the detail that made my breath catch in my throat was her clothing. She was wearing a faded yellow sundress with a torn lace collar. My stomach dropped. I lunged across the desk, grabbing the physical photo album my grandmother had passed down to me years ago. I flipped frantically through the yellowed pages, past black and white portraits of ancestors I barely knew, until I found it, a Kodak print from July 1984. A picnic in the backyard. And standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible behind my young mother, was a little girl in the exact same faded yellow sundress. My family had never talked about a sister. There was no record of her, no whispered stories over holiday dinners, no empty bedroom in the old house. I pulled up the metadata of the digital photograph again, checking the timestamp. It was taken yesterday at 4:15 p.m. in my parents' living room. At 4:15 p.m., I was sitting right there, holding the camera, looking directly through the viewfinder. I remembered the exact moment I pressed the shutter. The room had been warm, bathed in the orange glow of the late afternoon sun. I remembered telling my father to tilt his chin up. I remembered my mother laughing. I didn't remember the air suddenly turning freezing cold. I didn't remember the smell of damp earth and decay filling the living room. But looking at the digital file now, I realized the extra face wasn't just sitting behind my parents. Her pale, translucent hands were resting gently on my mother's shoulders. And my mother's smile in the photograph wasn't a warm, candid burst of laughter like I had remembered, it was a rigid, terrified grimace, her eyes wide and fixed on something standing just off camera. On me. I backed away from the monitor, my heart hammering against my ribs. The silence of my apartment felt heavy, almost liquid. A soft click echoed from my desk. The screen flickered. The digital photo zoomed in on its own, centering entirely on the extra face. As I watched in paralyzed horror, the image began to render a new frame, a glitch in the file or something far worse. The girl's eyes, previously turned toward the lens, shifted slightly to the left. She wasn't looking at where I had been standing when I took the picture. She was looking at where I was standing right now, in the corner of my bedroom. I reached out with a trembling hand to shut the laptop down, but before my fingers touched the power button, a fresh file auto-saved into the folder. A new photo, taken less than a second ago by my computer's built-in webcam. The image showed me standing in the dim light of my room, staring at the monitor with a pale, horror-stricken face. And right behind me, peering over my left shoulder with a wide, empty grin, was the little girl in the yellow dress. I turned around slowly into the dark, empty room, but there was nothing there. Only the cold draft blowing against the back of my neck, and the faint, unmistakable smell of wet soil. If she was never in the room when the shutter clicked, how did she know exactly where to look? Complete.